brave souls who stayed on to listen to our sessions at the graveyard shift. Ira Pande started her career as a university lecturer and taught for 16 years in the Punjab University in Chandigarh. Then she became an editor and a book reviewer for Biblio before she became the managing editor at a publishing house, a well-known publishing house. Her memoirs of her mother, the famous Hindi writer Shivani, was shortlisted for the Best Non-Fiction category for the Crossword Vodafone Award in 2006. In 2010, she was awarded the Crossword Vodafone Award and the Satya Academy for the best translated work in English for her translation of Mahinoor Shyam Joshi's Hindi novella, Tata Professor. Ira Pande now writes book reviews, articles for journals and newspapers, and she's done work for television. And for those of you film enthusiasts, she also acted in The Monsoon Wedding. So if you haven't watched it, do watch it and look for Ira. And now she works as a freelance writer and editor. It is my pleasure and an honor to welcome Ira Pande to this session, Ancestral Whispers, on the second day of the 5th Mountain Echoes in Bhutan. We will be looking at Ira's book, Didi, My Mother's Voice, in which she unravels the enigma that her mother was supposed to be. Her mother, the Hindi writer, her name was Ira Pande, but she used the pen name Shivani. Okay. I had the wonderful opportunity to talk with Ira a little bit yesterday before we sat in for this session, because we went to the RTC, and Ira talked to the students there, and I got to learn quite a bit from that session there. So I feel very privileged to be able to not to be asking too many things which were obvious. For instance, the method that she used in translating. It was a very useful method, useful information that she gave. She said, a translated work is not your work. It's a baby you have nurtured. So in fact, what you have done is you've nurtured your mother's work and made it your own. Didi, My Mother's Voice, is a seemingly simple book, but if you begin to read, already the prologue, in the second line, you begin to feel that it is much more complex. So Ira writes in the prologue that perhaps because we called our mother Didi, elder sister, our relationship with her was somewhat ambivalent. And then in the acknowledgement, she writes about her mother-in-law, who was a very good friend to you, and also the one who approved and gave her, in fact, the Nobel Prize for the translation of the book on her mother. And the word ambivalent and the enigma that Shivani was supposed to be, I think Ira has used a very fascinating and, for me, a very novel way of translating her mother's book, but putting in her own reminiscences and also inviting your sister to write. So it's really fascinating, the voices that you hear and the kind of person that you begin to see the mother actually emerges. Now, for somebody like me who never had a mother, and I'm trying now to write a chapter on her in my memoirs, and I feel it's really a dark tunnel I go into because she didn't need anything in writing, and it's a very kind of a risky journey that I take by trying to remember what my mother was like, and also by asking people who remember her. And for you, in a way you were blessed because you had two mothers, but at the same time I can see the complexity of how you balance the mother-in-law and your own mother, and you know, it was an ambivalent relationship. Could you talk a little bit about that?
I was an accidental biographer and writer, Kunzang. I never thought, I mean, all of us have always wanted to write a great book, or at least a book that you're proud of. I would have liked to write a book, but I was so intimidated by some very eminent writers in our clan and family that I was unable to find the confidence. Years ago, in fact, when I was working for Tejveer and Mala in Seminar, we were bringing out a special issue on Kashmir. And I thought this was the time when it was very turbulent in Kashmir. And I thought there must be some voice which brings out the angst and the turbulence that is happening there in individual lives. And we're not talking of the state and the politics. My mother's friend, Padma Sachdev, who's a well-known Dogri writer, I asked her whether she would have a story that would bring out various facets of this violence. And she gave me a story of hers written in Hindi called Mera Gudda Kahan Hai. It's a beautiful story about a little child and so on. I translated it and added it as a sort of afterword in that issue we brought out. And I do think it brought together several little strands that we were trying to put together. Padmaji came and said, thank you, it was a wonderful translation and so on. My mother, when Padmaji went away, my mother said, 9 mahine Padma ne tumko pet mein rakha tha ki maine rakha tha? Were you in her womb for 9 months or were you in mine? How come you've never translated anything of mine? And I didn't have the guts to tell her that as long as she was alive, I would be a very critical woman. And also fiction is very difficult to translate, as I was telling the children there yesterday, because direct speech transfers a whole cultural vocabulary into another. And you know, how do you deal with things like tum, tu, ah? We don't have, easy access to other languages. Anyhow, after my mother passed away, I thought, as a tribute to her, as a sort of unfulfilled promise, and also because I felt so many people don't know of her and of her writing simply because they don't know Hindi or don't read Hindi. And as Mala was saying that, that loss of Urdu and Farsi, it still exists in pockets in Delhi. It's just that those of us who don't speak that language or haven't heard it enough are unable to see it and hear it anymore. So as a kind of exercise, I started to translate some of the stories and some of the pieces, the non-fiction pieces that she had written. And I was fascinated by the unspoken stories behind each one of them, because I knew of why she had written of that character and who that person was. And it occurred to me that there was more than just a collection of translated stories here. I was talking to my husband about it and he said, why don't you write a memoir, string them together. And I thought to myself, how does one write of one's mother and a mother as strong as mine was? And he was the one who suggested, he said, you've always said your mother was a character, so why don't you look at her as a character? And that gave me the distance from her, because all biographers have this problem when they're writing of their own ancestors, or you don't want to say unkind things or things which show them in a poor light, especially if they are gone. And in India and all over the subcontinent, I'm sure, we're told and we are brought up to believe that our parents were the best. We cannot say. But they're not. They have flaws like each one of us do. They have their frailties. And when you begin, as a child, you may see a lot of things which don't make sense to you then. You file them away somewhere as a memory, as a visual memory or an oral memory. And one day it comes together and you're able to put it together and see a larger picture. So that's how this book really became a dialogue between my mother's life and my remembrance of it.
I just want to again go back to your prologue, because I think that says it all. you said after her death, it seemed to me as if she...
Right.
Oh, sorry. After her death, it seemed to me as if she had lodged herself in my head, because I could hear her voice constantly. And that is what we're talking about, the ancestral whispers. And some of us ignore the ancestral whispers, but Ira listened to the ancestral whispers. And what she said is that her apprehension was removed, or she saw the path to how she would go about, because of a very supportive spouse. Where is the spouse? Amir. Yeah. So he said, he gave her the way, and he said, write about her not as your mother or a biography, but as a character, and that's how she found her way to writing. And I just read in one of the reviews that you said it's not as literary as a biography, but rather an effort to bring out and present her mother as a character in her own world, in her own time. And I think that is fascinating, because she's talking about a completely, if we're talking about change, the previous session talked about how Delhi has changed for the worse, and all the rich values and everything, the beautiful architecture is gone. And her mother talks a lot about your major Almora.
Can I just read something?
Yes, yes, please.
This book is not meant to be anything as literary as a biography. Indeed, while writing it, I deliberately put aside all that I had ever learned as an editor. For the more I read her and tried to recreate her voice, the more I became involved in a psyche and a temperament that used the senses as well as the mind rather than the mere intellect. I do not know whether Didi herself necessarily understood or intended to understand this aspect of her work. For like so many writers, she could embody truth but did not always know it. Or if she did, she chose to hide it. In this sense, I suppose, every writer becomes a character in the fictional world he or she creates. I can't say whether this is a universal truth, but I do know that Didi bled into her plots, often without knowing that she was doing so. I suspect this was her way of marking a place for herself in everything she created, so that her voice would never be stilled or forgotten by anyone who had heard it. In the same way that she left a bit of herself in each of her children, she left bits of herself in every piece she wrote. Doubtless, there are several writers and artists who, like her, cannot bear to be excluded from the world that they create. Didi created her fictional universe from the part of her life that she loved best, her childhood and early years. Time and again, she used Kumaon and Bengal as the setting for her romantic novels, and she clung to these territories as a child to her mother's hand. They gave her the strength to face the encounters, people and places she feared to confront. A part of her, I am convinced, always stood at the top of her childhood home and looked down confidently at the passers-by on the road below, secure in the knowledge that she had something that none of them even knew. Now, this was an aspect which was visible to us because we grew up with her. And I wanted, because her kind of writing didn't appeal to me or my sensibility. She wrote of a time and of a kind of romantic fiction which has its own strength, but it wasn't something that reached out to me, and I felt bad, and I'm sure she also felt a little hurt that her own children, in a sense, rejected what she had written. And so I forced myself to go back to reading her in Hindi, a language that I had almost stopped reading, I'm ashamed to say. And when I started reading her in Hindi, I realized that when I gave up my English persona, I became more sensitive to a world that I knew was there, but I had ceased to see. And so these are the voices that come to you from a language which is your mother tongue in the truest sense of the word. Hindi is my mother tongue, I now realize. And that is why I have made translations now such an important part of my life. I really treat it as a kind of mission, that those of us who are blessed with a bilingual
would you have written what you've written about her in your own reminiscences if she was alive? For instance, here she is, yet Didi was also a fearful snob, an intellectual snob, and was instinctively drawn to the pure of spirit. Okay, and then there's also a passage that is beautiful and I cannot miss it. For a person as restless and alive as she was, one life, one pair of eyes, and one heart was not enough. And this comes through in your remembrances of her. But, you know, writing, this session is about the cues that we got to us to talk about the challenges, the pitfalls, the joys. So what were the challenges that you faced in writing, you know, openly about how you understood your mother? Because I think myself being a mother and having, you know, been the company of other mothers, mothers can never be right. Mothers can never be good.
There were 2 or 3 episodes of my mother's life which we were in denial about. One was the fact that my father was earlier married to a very beautiful girl called Ganga, who unfortunately died of tuberculosis within a year of their marriage and left behind a very small child. Within almost a year of his bereavement, my father was forced by his father, for the sake of that little child, to remarry. Meanwhile, my mother, who had a very different, a very progressive education, studied in Shivani and so on, their family had fallen on bad days. My grandmother was very anxious that all the girls should quickly be married off. So there was pressure on my mother too, and the 2 of them were married off by the families without ever realizing what they were doing to lives. And now when I think back, my mother must have been 20 or 21 when she got married. How many of us would have been able to bring up a child who was not your own? And within a year, my sister was born. And these 2 were like twins, to not be able to differentiate between one child and another. And do you know that my older sister, who's Nina, who is 12 years older than 7 years older than I am. I was almost 12 years old before I realized that she was not my own sister. That was a traumatic discovery. And I never had the courage to ask my mother who my father's first wife was, what was that great romance which I used to hear about from here and there, because it was one of these Heer Raja kind of stories in Kunzang. And my father's own grief was locked inside him, so he was a very moody and difficult person to get to know. As children, I didn't know all this. None of us realized what it was. I know that they had some a very turbulent and a very violent, but they were both very independent people. I've written about it. So that chapter was for me the most difficult to write. And you know, I had to really walk the razor's edge in order to preserve my love for my parents without giving way to the anger that I used to occasionally feel. I still do, at the way that, you know, they kept us away from secrets in their own life. So that was a very difficult chapter to write. There was one more chapter which was difficult, was the chapter on my sister, my eldest sister, Veena. You see, we have never ever acknowledged this relationship as a step relationship. I've always believed that she is a surrogate mother to all of us. Individually, we are all much closer to her than we are to each other. She's the favorite sister in the entire family. And how do I, you know, I remember when my mother passed away, Veena and I had gone to Lucknow to wind up the flat. And for the first time I asked her, I said, you know, isn't it strange that there's not a single picture of your mother amongst the things which my mother's covered when we opened it, all photographs came out. There was no picture of my father and Veena's mother. And so she said, that's because when I got married, Didi, my mother, had given her a box with her mother's jewelry and her photographs. And she said, they are with me now. But I said, you've been married for so many years, how come I've never seen these pictures in your house? So she said, you know, sense of the word, Didi was my mother. I don't remember my own mother. I was so small when she died. And so, I could have been so disloyal to Didi to put a picture of my own mother when she was the mother who brought me up. And now it seems pointless when they're both gone. What difference does it make whether they're inside a box or whether they're on the wall? So, things like this were difficult for me to write. And I had to ask Dino whether she was okay with my talking about a secret which had always remained a secret in our family. And I must say, she was so generous that none of my siblings had. I showed them the manuscript and I said, if there's anything that you want taken out, I will do so. But you can't be untruthful and you can't be dishonest and hold back secrets when you're writing of a life. So there are challenges, yes.
But obviously the joys and the satisfaction of what you've done for your mother's writings to open it up to a completely new segment of the audience is the joy of writing and listening to the Ancestral Whispers. And when you talked about your father and how traumatic, he went into the marriage with Ganga, knowing that she was very ill and against the family's wishes, but the description of him standing on the rain, waiting for a rain, holding the child, is, I'm sure your heart must have been numbed with emotions. Even I had to read it twice and I just could imagine it all the time. It really made a big impact on me because the picture was so graphic. You talked about how turbulent the relationship was, and yet in the end, what she writes, and I might request you to read it for me, read it for the audience, is what she wrote on your father, Baba. I think that's beautiful, and the only sad thing is that when he died, that she was able to appreciate and see what a wonderful man he was, and her literary career actually came out of their relationship.
This is an article which my mother put after my father passed away, and it's so moving that I can never read. I couldn't get myself to translate the whole of it. So I'll just read out one small excerpt from it. She says, "Where should I start? From that balmy spring evening when he came to our Haveli Mocha, which was festooned with garlands of mango leaves and glittering with lights. Riding an elephant as he led the wedding procession, he was greeted at the gates by the court singers Idia and Koel. The evening hummed with the music of the traditional bannas as they welcomed my bridegroom. Shall I start with the first time he held my hand? Or with the day before his death, when he heard me weep quietly in the dark and broke to hold my hand in a silent goodbye? My pen hovers between the two memories. The first one recalls the joy with which I agreed to abide by all the rules of a good Hindu wife, among the chanting the Sanskrit mantras. The second takes me cruelly to the cold, hard steps of the Sati Ghat in Haridwar to remind me where that journey ended, and I stood alone under the sultry monsoon sky, looking at the serene waters of the Ganga. I climbed down the steps and wade waist deep into the cool waters of the river. Our family priest, Pandit Hariramji, avoids my eyes as his deep voice asks me to take a handful of the holy waters and say, Chita Dah Shamanathan. With this water, I cool the embers of your funeral pyre. However hard I try, I cannot erase the sight of the funeral pyre and his body burning on it. My lips can hardly mumble the words. Another bullet is ready to pierce my ears. As Hariramji goes on with the chants, he prefixes spirit, to the name that I loved above all. A dagger twists itself into my heart each time, and I turn my gaze away from him. It falls on my son. His young face is steeped in a sadness that he can hardly comprehend as he repeats the mantras after the priest. Each line hammers one nail after another into our hearts. It is time now for molten glass to be poured into our ears. Take all his everyday belongings and throw them into these waters, we are told. My son bends to pick them up from a bundle at our feet, and I watch watch each one float away as it is dropped into the flowing river. The last to bob away are his spectacles. They raise their head from the waters, and the sunlight glints on one lens as it tries to catch my eye, then gives up and quietly sinks. Goes on, but I don't want to.
We have less than 10 minutes, and we could continue for the whole. It's such a pleasure listening to your reading and your reminiscences and your, about your mother. And I'm sure the audience will stay on if we have to be pushed with the 10-minute marker. So now we'll open it to the audience, and if you have any questions for Ira, please. By the way, the book...
Everyone's going to see, this is a terrible time, I know.
The exciting thing is that these books are still available, and Ira will sign them for.
It's not getting me gone to sleep, it's just been so, it's just been so poignant and so moving that there's nothing to say. Thank you.
Yes.
My grandmother was the first doctor. She was the first one who got a gold medal in my family, and she was kind of like the first doctor. And so there's always this more than the paternal and patriarchal. There was always a more woman power kind of thing in my family, and the relationships that went around it. There is a whole unique flavor, right, in such a relationship. So what is it? What according to you is that, uniqueness in the flavor? Because the most important thing according to me is there's emotion involved. And then there are different flavors in that emotion. But how would you describe it?
Look, no relationship is monochromatic. You have so many multiple ways in which you look at a person and remember that person. My memories of my mother are very different from my sister's memories, who's also a writer, and who's written about her very differently from me. What I'm saying is that yes, we were aware that we came from a very strong matriarchal line. My grandmother, my great-grandmother, my mother, all of our sisters as our husbands will testify, are not easy to get along with or survive. But that isn't the most important thing. I think that strength should come not as an ideological statement, but as a reflection of how they dealt with relationships in their life. And my mother was a very fierce upholder of feminism, and progressive, secular woman. At the same time, a very deeply believing, faithful to her religion, very fiercely proud of her clan, of her Brahminism. So all that gets mixed up. That's why that passage that Kunzang read out, she had no social snobbery. Towards the end of her life, she lived like a fakir in her flat in Lucknow, and she had 3 or 4 retainers and things, a monkey called Ramkali, her rickshawala called Kutubali, some andewala called Suleiman, and all kinds of people who had. She had no, they used to all come and sit with her and have their morning tea with her. And she made no difference between us and them. They called her Nani, like my children called her Nani. But at the same time, she was an intellectual snob. She liked the pure spirit, those who she saw as being honest and true to themselves. She had immense love for. But those who she felt were dishonest in any way, or who were putting on person. There are lots of instances in this book where she had a great sense of humor, a wonderful sense of humor, and she laughed at herself as much as she made fun of all of us. So I think all of us were given a peg in our childhood and told exactly what we were worth. And so at one level, I have a lot of confidence, but I also suffer from terribly low self-esteem. I have to push myself into even speaking publicly. Once I start, then I'm my mother's daughter. Then I can hold forth. But my legs and knees quake before I come on. So we have all these mixtures in us, and I think I'll be able to bring out some of these inconsistencies or odd things about them.
Should we take one more question or comment?
I've got a question. You came to know your sister was not your real sister at the age of 12.
Yes.
How did you come to know this fact?
You know, it's a very, we used to live in this large house which was an office cum residence. And as a child I used to go down and, play around with typewriters and things in the office with the clerks. One day one of the clerks there mentioned that, and where is your stepsister? I said, who's my stepsister? I don't have a stepsister. He said, oh, you didn't know. What a great lady your mother must be. So I came running to my mother and said, we have a stepsister, you never told us about. And she said, where did you hear this nonsense? I said, so she had slapped me immediately and said, I told you never to go down to the office. Why did you go there? But she never denied it. Then, of course, as I grew older, I got to hear bits and pieces from here and there. And then my mother-in-law, who had known that lady and who knew the entire history, told me exactly. My mother never told me on this. I got to know it from my mother-in-law, that this was what had happened and this is what. So
and what major changes in your attitude took place after the full knowledge?
I've written about this if you can. I would prefer it to be read here rather than my saying it here. But one anger against my father for having a wife who was not my mother. Two, anger at my mother for having hidden this secret from all of us. And a deep sense of compassion and shame towards my older sister, that have I ever said anything to hurt her? Have we treated her badly? And after that, I would, be so good to her that she began to say, please go back to being what you were. I can't take this. Yes,
This question is a little difficult to formulate. Since you talk so much about the personal. Sorry, I've got a bad throat. Did you have to struggle with the question of intimacy and distance in form? It was very difficult to talk about very personal things, and now in the public having to answer these questions.
It's like losing your virginity once, Sonia. Once you've written it all there and it's there for everyone to read, what is there to hide? My mother died many years ago. I paid her my greatest tribute, I think. Nothing will ever alter that love. And if people wish to see flaws and frailties in her, well, I'm okay with that. I don't see her as that.
Add something?
Yes, please.
I must have been in the garden, I remember, when my mother made up her mind to learn Hindi. And that was, she spoke fluent English, Persian, Urdu, but she didn't know Hindi. And that was because her friends were, at that time, discussing a novel called Choden, which was written by your mother. And it was her mother was probably at that time the most sensational, the best author, really sought after in North India. And my mother learned her Hindi to be able to read Shivani.
I can see that everybody's really not sleepy, but everybody's very moved, and everybody's relating and thinking of what you've heard. And for that, we really thank Ira for being here and so openly and candidly sharing her own personal stories. Let's give her a big, big hand.